The 20th birthday party was a performance of hollow luxury. It was a blur of expensive catering and scripted laughter echoing through the stone-vaulted halls of our Kentucky estate. While my parents, Kenneth and Patricia, raised glasses of vintage champagne to a communal future, I felt like a glitch in their system. They weren't celebrating my transition into adulthood. They were salivating over the date they believed the keys to this $10,500,000 property would legally change hands. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family while everyone else took the credit? Let me know your story down in the comments. I read every single one. And if you believe boundaries are a form of self-respect, hit that subscribe button. The noise of the party became a dull hum as I slipped through the shadows of the foyer and closed the heavy library doors. The room smelled of old leather, linseed oil, and wood polish. It was the only place in this $10,500,000 museum that still felt real. My grandfather's spirit was in these books, in the silence of the cedar shelves he had built with his own hands. Outside, my parents and my brother Tyler were already dividing the spoils. I could hear Tyler's loud, arrogant laugh through the walls. He was probably already telling his investors about the massive infusion of cash he expected to receive tomorrow. He didn't realize his startup was built on air, and his safety net was about to be sliced open. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel like crying. My emotions had been systematically cauterized over years of being the invisible structural support to Tyler's national emergencies. Anger wasn't loud tonight. It was clinical. It was a cold calculation of assets and liabilities. I sat at the mahogany desk and pulled out my phone. The blue light hit the wood grain like a scanner. The screen glowed with the final confirmation page from the legal portal. The irrevocable trust was ready. This was the digital wall I had spent months designing. With my grandfather's lawyer, Walter. It was an architectural masterpiece of law, a fortress of facts. In their world, family affection was a subscription service I was expected to pay for with my silence and my labor. They saw me as the silent investor in their version of a family, but they had overdrafted my compassion years ago. Now, the account was officially closed. I watched the grandfather clock in the corner, its pendulum swinging like a heavy, mechanical heartbeat. Its mechanical sigh filled the room as the hands converged on midnight, 11:59. My pulse didn't race. It felt like a steady, silent countdown. My thumb hovered over the screen. I wasn't just moving money. I was auditing a relationship that had been in the red for 20 years. I was finally applying the physics of their rot against them. I pressed the confirm button. The digital signature was scorched into the record, permanent and immutable. In that quiet second, I funneled the entire $10,500,000 legacy into a private trust they couldn't penetrate. Not with their predictable guilt trips, not with high-priced lawyers, not with the "we raised you" narrative they loved to weaponize when they needed a check. To them, this estate was just square footage and potential revenue for Tyler's next failed venture. To me, it was the museum of the only genuine love I'd ever known. It was the grain of the wood my grandfather taught me to read. I wasn't betraying blood. Blood had been a hollowed-out account for a long time. I was protecting the only thing that was ever real in this house. The transaction was complete at 12:03 a.m. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single moment of regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. Inside the library, my phone glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of cold facts, hard numbers, and quiet retribution. I stood up and straightened my dress. The keys were no longer up for grabs. I held the only copy, and the revolution had just begun. The silence that settled over the house after that initial digital confirmation was heavy, but it wasn't lonely. It was the kind of quiet you finally notice after a loud, persistent ringing in your ears finally stops. I sat at the mahogany dining table, tracing the wood grain, and let my mind drift back to how I became the person capable of locking my own parents out of a $10,500,000 estate. I grew up as what psychologists call the invisible child, but in our house, I was more like a load-bearing beam. Essential, structural, and completely unacknowledged, unless the ceiling started to sag. My brother, Tyler, was the sun around which my parents orbited. I learned early on that my role was to provide the stability that allowed them to shine. When I was 12 years old, I remember winning the Regional Horse Breeding Conservation Award. I had spent 3 months building a detailed record of equine lineage and genetic preservation with surgical precision. When I brought the plaque home, my mother didn't even look up from Tyler's scraped knee. She told me to go get the antiseptic from the cabinet because Tyler might have an infection. The award sat on the kitchen counter for 3 weeks until I moved it to the garage myself. That was the recurring blueprint of my life. My achievements were minor footnotes. Tyler's minor inconveniences were national emergencies. By the time I was 17 years old, I had been accepted into a prestigious animal sciences program with a full ride scholarship. I didn't tell them for months. I knew the reaction would be a calculation of how my absence would affect their convenience. When they finally found out, they didn't celebrate. Instead, they sold my truck, the one I'd bought with 3 years of saved waitress tips, to buy Tyler a professional cinema drone. My father reasoned that I wouldn't need a vehicle in the city, and Tyler needed the gear for his nascent career. He called Tyler the future of the family brand. He told me I was just the overhead. I didn't argue. I didn't even raise my voice. I just walked to my room and opened a fresh ledger. I realized then that my compassion had been a resource they had overdrafted for years, and the account was officially closed. I started observing them, the way an architect studies a condemned building, looking for the stress fractures. I saw the cracks in their spending, the leased cars, the designer clothes they couldn't afford, and the way they looked at my grandfather's estate as a giant insurance payout. This is the hidden cost of being the responsible one in a toxic home. You learn to hide your wins because they'll be confiscated. You learn to hide your plans because they'll be sabotaged. I became a fixer who never asked for help, not because I was strong, but because I knew the rescue party wasn't coming. I was the silent partner in their version of a family, footing the emotional bill while they lived in a collective fantasy. For years, I kept the ledgers of our household, not just the financial ones, but the ones involving patience and unrequited loyalty. I realized that my existence was a specialized kind of infrastructure. I was the one who ensured the bills were paid and the heritage horses were fed, while my parents and Tyler treated the estate like a lottery win they had already spent. This is what happens in the trap of cruelty normalization. My parents didn't wake up one day and decide to be monsters. Instead, they spent 20 years slowly convincing themselves that my neglect was a standard operating procedure. It started with small withdrawals, a forgotten birthday here, a dismissed achievement there, until the theft of my identity became as natural to them as breathing. When cruelty is normalized, the victim isn't seen as a person to be loved, but as a resource to be exploited. They had reached a point where they were no longer shocked by what they were doing to me. They were only shocked that I might one day stop playing along. In their eyes, I wasn't a daughter. I was an emotional and financial insurance policy. I was a high-limit credit card with no expiration date. My compassion had been a luxury. They had overdrafted for years, and they never once bothered to check the balance. They believed that because they had provided the bare minimum of food and shelter during my childhood, they had purchased a lifetime of my submission. It was a toxic contract. I never signed a subscription service where I was the only one paying the fees. But silence isn't just submission. It is a period of preparation. While Tyler was busy trashing the historical barns for viral content, and my parents were touring Mediterranean villas they couldn't afford, I was in the library auditing the specific terms of my grandfather's trust. I was learning the physics of their rot. I watched them the way a structural engineer looks at a building, condemned by its own weight. I saw the stress fractures in their logic and the termite damage in their loyalties. I knew that on my 20th birthday, the power would shift irrevocably. I didn't need them to see me or validate my work anymore. I just needed them to stay exactly as they were, arrogant, entitled, and completely unaware that the background noise they had ignored for 2 decades was about to become the only voice left in the room. The audit was nearing its end, and the final balance was 0. Inside my mind, I was already moving my furniture out of their lives, leaving them with nothing but the empty, echoing halls of their own greed. The next morning, the bluegrass mist was thick enough to erase the horizon. I stood on the wide stone porch, my coffee black and cold, watching the gravel drive. A massive moving truck emerged from the whiteout, its engine a low, predatory growl that vibrated in my chest. Following it was my parents' sleek black car. They stepped out, wearing a kind of triumphant arrogance that made my skin crawl. My father, Kenneth, adjusted his tailored coat, his eyes scanning the limestone walls of the estate, as if he were already measuring the space for demolition. My mother, Patricia, stood beside him, her face set in a mask of practiced efficiency. Behind them stepped my uncle, Gregory, a man whose smile always felt like a closing cost. He was a high-end real estate broker who saw land only as a commodity to be liquidated. "We've got it all organized, Brianna," my father announced, not even glancing at me as he signaled the movers toward the front door. He spoke to me as if I were a lingering tenant whose lease had expired. "We've reached a deal with a luxury developer. This farm belongs to the family unit now, and the unit has decided to pivot. It's time you moved your things to the workers' cottage, down by the creek." He didn't notice the man in the charcoal suit, standing in the shadows behind me, or the sheriff's deputy leaning against the stone railing. He didn't realize that in the eyes of the law, he was already a stranger at the gate. My mother stepped forward, her voice dripping with that familiar, hollow sweetness. "We're being reasonable, honey. We've already had the movers pack your essentials. We need the main house clear for the surveyors. They're coming to map out the initial 9 holes of the new golf course." I watched Uncle Gregory reach into the back of his car and pull out a sold sign, his movement sharp and self-satisfied. He looked at the historical barns, the result of 3 generations of blood and sweat, and saw nothing but square footage and potential commission. To them, my grandfather's passing wasn't a loss to be mourned. It was a $10,500,000 lottery ticket that had finally been cashed. They were so blinded by the prospect of an easy payout that they hadn't even bothered to check the locks. Kenneth finally looked up at me, his jaw tightening when he realized I hadn't moved. "Did you hear me? The movers are on a schedule. This house is a family asset, and Tyler needs the liquidity from this sale to save his startup. You're just the overhead, Brianna. You always have been." He turned back to the truck, waving the crew forward. He thought his authority was structural, part of the foundation of my life. He didn't realize I had spent the last 24 hours dismantling every pillar he stood on. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. It was the realization that the people who raised me were willing to pave over their own history for a quick infusion of cash. I didn't say a word. I just stepped aside, allowing the front door to open, revealing the man who held the true inventory of their betrayal. The man in the charcoal suit stepped out from the library shadows, his movement precise and lethal. It was Walter, my grandfather's longest-serving ally, and a specialist in the kind of ironclad law that doesn't leave survivors. Behind him, Deputy Miller shifted his weight, the metallic jingle of his belt sounding like a funeral bell in the morning mist. Uncle Gregory's smirk didn't just fade, it disintegrated, as Walter reached out and took the manila envelope from his hand. The silence on the porch was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of the fog from the limestone eaves. Walter pulled out the supposed 99-year lease and adjusted his spectacles with a calm that felt like a surgical strike. He didn't raise his voice as he pointed to the signature at the bottom, my grandfather's name, scrawled in a shaky, forced hand that looked like it had been traced by a ghost. Walter looked Gregory dead in the eye and stated, for the record, that he had been at my grandfather's bedside for that entire afternoon 4 months ago. He reminded everyone that my grandfather was already in a deep, irreversible coma, let alone capable of signing a complex property transfer. Then came the second blow, delivered with clinical detachment. Walter revealed that the notary stamp on the document belonged to a firm that had been shut down for fraud 2 years ago. The blood drained from Gregory's face, leaving it the color of the Kentucky clay. My father, Kenneth, finally looked up, his jaw dropping in a way that suggested his carefully constructed world was finally suffering a total structural failure. He started to stammer, asking what was happening, and insisting the lease was a legal instrument they had all agreed upon to save the family brand. Walter's response was cold and factual. It wasn't an instrument, it was a forged document. It was a felony. And more importantly, Walter had a report from a forensic accountant tucked inside his briefcase. Gregory hadn't just faked the lease to secure the land. He had used Tyler's desperation to secure his own future. I looked at my parents as the realization hit them. They had been so blinded by the hunger for easy money that they hadn't even checked if their own brother was robbing them blind. They were so eager to push me out into the workers' cottage that they had invited a predator into their vault. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was the realization that the people who raised me were willing to build their future on a foundation of theft. Walter then dropped the final hammer. Tyler hadn't just been a witness. He had provided the digital passwords to the corporate accounts, believing Gregory was investing the funds into his startup. In reality, Gregory had embezzled $1,400,000 to cover his own gambling debts and failing real estate flips. I watched Deputy Miller take a step toward Gregory, the handcuffs glinting in the dull light. The communal future they had toasted to, with vintage champagne, was crumbling in real time. Right there on the wet gravel of the driveway, the atmosphere shifted from a triumphant takeover to a clinical crime scene. My mother, Patricia, began to shriek, turning on Gregory and accusing him of ruining everything they had built for Tyler. But Tyler was just standing there, his face pale, realizing his audience was watching his entire legacy collapse in high definition. The physics of their rot had finally reached the breaking point. Forging a dead man's signature and stealing over $1 million wasn't a family dispute. It was a federal crime. The audit was over, and the ledger was finally balanced. I watched as Deputy Miller clicked the metal cuffs around Gregory's wrists, the sound sharp and final, against the backdrop of idling engines. My father started to protest, his voice cracking as he reached out toward his brother. But the deputy didn't even look up. He told my father that forging a dead man's signature and stealing $1,400,000 wasn't a family dispute. It was a crime. It was fascinating to see how quickly their united front disintegrated when the reality of prison entered the frame. My mother, who had been measuring the hallway for new wallpaper just minutes ago, suddenly turned on Gregory like a wounded predator. She began to shriek that he had ruined everything, that they were supposed to be building a future for Tyler, and that Gregory had betrayed the very blood he shared. Her loyalty lasted exactly as long as the prospect of a payout. Tyler was still holding his phone, but the smug digital confidence was gone. He looked around at the moving crewmen who were already dropping boxes back onto the gravel and realized his audience was watching his nascent career collapse in high definition. He started to cry, asking me to tell the deputy that they didn't know anything about the forgery. I looked at my brother, at the person who had been the son of my parents' universe for 2 decades, and felt only the cold clarity of a finished audit. I told them I wasn't letting anyone take this house, because you can't take what you don't own. I informed my father, whose face was a mask of grey defeat, that I had already finalized the irrevocable trust. This property was legally protected. They weren't losing the house today. They were being evicted from it. My mother gasped, calling me ridiculous and reminding me that they had raised me. I told her they had raised the background noise. I told her they had raised a ghost who paid the property taxes while they plotted to sell her legacy. I said they didn't want a daughter. They wanted a silent investor who never asked for dividends. I told them the audit was over and they were officially bankrupt. I turned to Deputy Miller and filed a formal trespass warning right there on the porch. I gave them exactly 60 minutes to remove their personal belongings from the main house. My father begged, his eyes red and desperate, asking where they were supposed to go. I didn't answer. I just handed my mother a pre-drafted legal notice and a copy of the new security codes. I told her that his tuition checks had been a loan I'd already repaid with interest. Then, I turned my back. I walked up the stone steps, passing the movers, who were now scurrying, to put my grandfather's furniture back where it belonged. As I reached the front door, I stopped, and looked back. I told Gregory the sheriff had a car waiting for him. I told the rest of them that the fog was lifting and they should find their way out before the view became too clear for them to handle. I stepped inside and closed the heavy limestone door. For the first time in my life, I heard the lock click, and I knew exactly who held the key. 6 months have passed. Since that morning, the fog lifted, and I watched my family being escorted off the property. The silence at Bluegrass Legacy is different now. It is no longer the suffocating silence of things left unsaid or the tense quiet of people plotting a theft. It is the deep, restorative peace of a house that has finally been cleared of its rot. The court proceedings were swift and clinical. Uncle Gregory is currently serving a significant sentence in a federal facility for title fraud and embezzlement. My parents, Kenneth and Patricia, are living in a cramped 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of town. Their credit scores incinerated and their social standing gone. Tyler's digital career didn't survive the viral footage of our eviction. It turns out that digital audiences have very little sympathy for a golden child whose entire lifestyle was built on a forgery and the exploitation of his sister. I watched their downfall from a distance, and it taught me something fundamental about the illusion of power. My family lived in the trap of the empty wallet. Their authority, their pride, and their very identities were just a suit of armor they had rented with my grandfather's money. They confused having wealth with being valuable. When the trust was locked and the cash stopped flowing, they didn't just lose their designer clothes and Mediterranean vacations. They lost the ability to stand upright because they never had an internal foundation. They were fragile because their power was a performance. And without an audience and a budget, the play was over. I stand on the deck now, looking out over the rolling green hills of the estate. In my hand isn't a coffee mug or a champagne glass, but a set of blueprints for a new sustainable housing and equine preservation project I'm designing. I've realized that protecting what matters sometimes means releasing the people who refuse to value it. We are taught from birth that blood is the ultimate bond, but I've learned that is a dangerous lie. True family isn't something you are born into. It is something you build through consistent actions, shared integrity, and mutual respect. To those of you listening who have ever felt like the invisible one, like the background noise in your own home, I want to speak directly to you. You are not a glitch in their system. You are the infrastructure that has been holding it together. You are the load-bearing beam they choose to ignore until the moment you decide to stop carrying their weight. Setting boundaries isn't an act of betrayal or cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. It is the moment you stop being a victim of their expectations and start being the architect of your own life. I have finally found my level. A legacy isn't just about property or bank accounts. It's about the integrity of the person holding the keys. For the first time in my life, the view from here is perfectly clear. If this story helped you find the courage to set your own boundaries, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to join our community of quiet strength, and let's keep building fortresses of self-respect together.